Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host of this Democracy Forum debate, where we discuss global issues of the day, often reaching conclusions that you won't see in the mainstream media and commentary. For the next 90 minutes, we will exchange ideas about democracy. Can it survive? What exactly is democracy? Is it an election? Is it accountability and transparency? Was it once thought to be a mechanism that brings good governments that may have passed its sell-by date? Yes, many questions, particularly those being raised by the now louder voices of the Global South. And to answer them and be challenged on what they say, we have a brilliantly expert panel. Richard Youngs, Dawn Brancati, Giselle, Bosse, and Nic Cheeseman. But before we go to them, I will ask the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Democracy Forum, which brings you this webinar to examine the impact of the America First policies of the Trump administration and the likely consequences for democracy and human rights around the world. I'm very grateful to the team at Democracy Forum for pulling this event together today and for securing the participation of such a well-informed and influential panel. And my thanks, as always, to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. In the 3 months which have elapsed since the United States presidential inauguration, it is becoming clear that the American First policy of President Trump has 3 basic elements: an indifference to liberal values, scorn for global norms and rules, and a cold-eyed focus on the national interest. Rather than supporting the international status quo, the United States instead appears poised to become the leading disruptor. No longer are the biggest geopolitical risks facing the world connected with China and Russia, writes Ivo Dalda of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. But now the biggest risk is us. It's America. Or as John Eikenberry of Princeton University reflects, I quote, "A revisionist state has arrived on the scene to contest the liberal international order. It is the United States. It's Trump in the Oval Office, the beating heart of the free world, poised to contest almost every element of the liberal international order: trade, alliances, migration, multilateralism, solidarity between democracies, and human rights." As Stuart Patrick writes for the Carnegie Endowment, we are facing the death of the world that America made, where President Trump's policies, I quote, "will accelerate the fragmentation of a tottering world already beset by centrifugal forces rising from geopolitical competition, surging popular nationalism, stalled development, destabilizing technologies, and a deepening climate emergency." And nowhere is this process more evident than the executive orders issued by President Trump on the 3rd of February, which will irredeemably affect the international commitments forged by the United States at the UN over the last 70 years, withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, reconsidering membership of UNESCO, and ceasing the funding for the United Nations Relief Agency responsible for Palestinian refugees. In principle, the directive could lead to a United States abrogation of thousands of treaties and a departure from hundreds of multilateral organizations, concludes the Carnegie Endowment. Commenting on the dawning reality of the America First initiative, the writer Joseph Nye suggests, I quote, "A nation's soft power rests upon its culture, its values, and its policies when they are seen as legitimate by others. That legitimacy is affected by whether a nation's actions are perceived as congruent with or contradicting widely held values." But President Trump has made no secret of his distaste for open-ended alliance commitments and the liberal values that undergird the transatlantic alliance. There is increasing evidence of the ripple effects of this behavior, where the dismantling of constitutional checks and balances in the United States is encouraging autocratic behavior in other countries where democratic government is already threatened, such as Israel, Hungary, and Turkey. Benjamin Netanyahu's dismissal of the director of Israel's domestic security agency, Ronen Bar, for refusing to put personal loyalty above respect for the law was reportedly inspired by Donald Trump, whose disruptive rhetoric he's emulating closely, writes Shalom Lipner for the Atlantic Council. Equally worrying is the silence of the United States State Department when confronted by the assault on the democratic process in Turkey, resulting in the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul and his disqualification from the 2028 presidential election. As Bilal Bilici, an opposition parliamentarian, observes, America doesn't care as it used to. Human rights, rule of law, equality, freedoms, it's not top of the agenda anymore. Autocrats feel encouraged and giving more space to their autocratic counterparts. It's a shocking and slippery path. And Larry Jacobs, director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota, warns, I quote, "You'd have to have your eyes fully closed, not to be deeply concerned and outraged about the vacuum that Donald Trump is operating now. United States democracy has died this month. At this moment, the idea of an accountable representative system, as the framers of the Constitution wrote, is no longer possible." So perhaps it's worth reminding ourselves of the remarks of Benjamin Franklin on the last day of the Constitutional Convention, the 18th of September, 1787, when a delegate approached him and asked, "Well, Dr. Franklin, do we have a republic or a monarchy?" "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much for that. A republic, if you can keep it. We're saying a democracy. Can we keep it with autocrats feeling encouraged? Our panelists will speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, after which there will be a back and forth with questions. And as Lord Bruce said, put your questions into the comments and the chat, and we will feed them in. Our first panelist is Professor Richard Youngs of the Carnegie Foundation and from the University of Warwick. He has previously been with Britain's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and among his many books, the most recent carries the apt title for our debate, Democratic Crossroads, Transformations in 21st Century Politics. Questions about democracy, however, long precede Donald Trump. So can it survive? Richard Youngs, give us your argument.
My answer to the question is an unequivocal yes. Democracy can survive and it can prosper. That will not be easy. The problems facing democracy are multiple. They are profound. They are very persistent. They have been gathering force over many years. We certainly have learned in recent times that democracy is not an automatic default option. If democracy is to survive, there needs to be stronger and more effective, more purposeful action to defend democratic norms around the world. We're asked here to address the specific question of the impact of what's going on now in the United States. Clearly, all the developments that Lord Bruce just outlined represent a clear menace to democratic norms. We see pronounced democratic backsliding in the United States itself. The end of US international assistance deprives democratic actors around the world of vital assistance. So clearly, these trends are extremely negative and extremely worrying for democracy. At the same time, I don't think we should think that what is going on in the US determines absolutely everything around the world. Most of the factors that determine whether or not democracy survives are quite specific to local contexts, individual countries around the world, and they exist quite separate from what is going on in the United States. The situation is serious, but I don't think Trump alone completely obliterates all the other factors that will determine, positive and negative, that affect democracy's fate around the world. The situation affecting democracy is clearly serious, and one should not minimize this. At the same time, one shouldn't forget that autocracies are also suffering problems. In these kind of debates, we often have the impression that all the problems are on democracy's side and autocratic regimes are doing very well. That is not the case. Autocratic regimes themselves are often struggling to push back public discontent in their countries. Often we have a situation where leaders begin along autocratic paths and simply don't have the institutional capacity to follow through those autocratic projects and face democratic backlash from their own populations. That's an important factor to bear in mind. We are not living in an era of democratic apathy, quite the opposite. Over the last decade, we've seen a range of different democratic actions gathering force around the world to try at least and hold at bay the authoritarian surge. Protests, new civil society actions, new civic movements, new experiments in direct democracy as well. None of this is new. What is needed, however, is for all these different democratic actions to knit together into a strategy that is capable of having higher level political impact. It seems to me that is the factor that will determine whether or not democracy really survives in the future. I think one of the most important areas in this new citizen mobilization relates to climate change. For me, the challenge of climate change is that which will either kill off democracy or lead to a revival of democracy. If authoritarian regimes show themselves to be better able to deal with the climate crisis, then I think democracy is in existential trouble. The positive side of the equation is that today, around the world, it is the climate issue that is doing most to mobilize people, to give people an incentive to have a voice in the way that the climate transition takes place. So it could be this angle, more than any other issue, I think, that acts as a platform for reviving the vibrancy of democracy in the future. So, Humphrey, I will leave it there. My basic argument is that there is this nuanced balance. Democracy can survive, but we need far better strategies, more targeted strategies to make sure it does do so. Crucially, for this, we need a better understanding of the different challenges facing democracy and an understanding that the authoritarian threat takes very different forms across different countries. In many places, it is pure repression. In other cases, it's the more subtle and difficult issue that many citizens seem to be drawn to authoritarianism today as offering better solutions than democracy. That's a more difficult challenge to get hold of, but I think will do more than anything to determine whether democracy can prosper in the future, which means my headline conclusion would be this, that democracy can survive, but in surviving, democracy itself will need to change the way it works in the future.
Thank you, Richard Youngs, very much for that. As our first panelist, I'm going to give you two questions that have come in from the audience to ground our debate. Prashant Kumar, do definitions of democracy vary in different parts of the world?
They do. I think there's a common core. The debate about whether there are different regionally specific forms of democracy has been going on for many, many decades. It's actually quite difficult to pin.
What would you say is the common thread that runs through a democracy as opposed to an autocracy?
Free competition for power, respect of rights, rule of law, not rule through the law. They're generally regarded as being the minimal definitions. Beyond that, of course, there are different institutional variations that can and should be given room to develop in different regions around the world. But I think that core should be respected and supported. around the world. There are differences. It's not the case that all citizens in one particular country or region agree on a model of democracy. The model of democracy itself needs to be subject to open democratic debate. That's why democracy is important.
It's open debate. David Willis asks, should democracy be an end in itself? I'm not quite sure we've defined what it is yet, or simply a means to an end, e.g. as creating as just and representative society as possible.
Democracies certainly need to sharpen their record in delivering concrete benefits, services, economic security. And the fact that they have failed to do so in the recent is a very good question, because the fact that democracies have been not completely successful in delivering those end products is one of the reasons why support for democracy has atrophied in many places of the world around different countries over the last decade. But I still think democracy does have intrinsic value, the value of living in freedom, free from the fear of authoritarian interference. And I think that intrinsic value should not be lost from sight. And all the polls, all the evidence shows that basic core value of democracy is still respected across all different regions and countries of the world. For all democracies' difficulties in delivering certain policy outputs, for all the debates about the need for different kinds of democracy in the world, that core does seem to be a universal aspiration, at least.
And you don't agree with the premise that you referred to, that authoritarian governments, such as China has proved it, beyond the pale, Singapore to a certain extent, they can actually deliver better at a certain level of development than a democracy can. You don't buy that?
Well, I certainly think there are authoritarian regimes that have delivered certain developmental objectives, climate objectives, security objectives better than democracies. The overall evidence, political scientists have been debating this issue forever. The evidence suggests that isn't the case, Humphrey. There may be individual authoritarian regimes that have done relatively well. In general, authoritarian regimes do not do demonstrably better than democracies on any of these issues. It depends very much on the context. And we shouldn't underestimate how difficult authoritarian political parties and leaders themselves find it to institutionalize their own political projects or to stabilize their own political goals. We have seen in many countries in the world that they start along a path towards more autocratic rule, and then they are pushed back by their own population. So authoritarianism can itself suffer great instability just as much as democracy.
Yes. Okay. And I just have to ask you to clarify, because I think you just described the current American administration as a menace to democratic norms. Yet this administration was elected on the platform that it is delivering. So how does that circle square with our attempted definition of democracy?
Well, I think for all the reasons that Lord Bruce just outlined, I think Dawn will give us greater detail on. They were elected, of course, on a democratic mandate, but they're following now what is a very, very familiar authoritarian playbook of chipping away at checks and balances and undermining the quality of democracy. Just how far that will go, I think, is uncertain. At the moment, the US is hovering in this gray zone between democracy and autocracy. It's very difficult to pin down a particular line or point at which a country moves from being democratic to autocratic. But the US is in that kind of gray zone at the moment, and it's not clear just how far its democracy will decline in the quality of its pluralistic democratic checks and balances.
Thank you so much for that. Please stay around. I'm sure we're going to come back to you. The debate is just beginning. And next, we're going to examine Europe and its help or hindrance in anchoring democracy. Our panelist is Professor Giselle Bosse of the EU Eternal Democracy Promotion and Jean Monnet Chair in the EU International Relations at Maastricht University. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. She has looked very closely at democracy in all those places, has published widely, is a familiar face on many broadcast outlets. Giselle Bosse, tell us what you know.
Thank you so much. Now, as you already mentioned very kindly, my focus will be on the EU's role in supporting democracy, and especially also in its closer neighborhood and through enlargement policy. Because if we're talking EU foreign policy and all the deficits it may have, but when it comes to enlargement, at least here there used to be a consensus that here the EU has played a significant role, and it's one of its most significant and successful foreign policy tools. But let's be honest, the landscape has changed very much, and it is not just the Trump administration that is causing significant problems for EU's democracy agenda in accession countries, but it also it amplifies a number of other very serious and unprecedented challenges that the EU is facing in accession countries. And we're seeing at the moment democratic backsliding in places like Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also, of course, Georgia. Reforms have stalled in North Macedonia and Montenegro, and these were actually also sort of the leading countries when it came to democratic reforms. And of course, there are intense geopolitical pressures aside, of course, from a new, revisionist power in town. There's, of course, Russian Federation, conventional and hybrid warfare, disinformation campaigns, open support for illiberalism, China's alternative development models, and of course also populist leadership and illiberal reforms within the accession countries themselves. And that adds, problems, structural corruption in several countries, and this kind of new phenomenon of accession countries running multi-vector foreign policies. Now, this is also often to resist EU democratic conditionality. So in short, the EU's old playbook isn't working anymore. And I don't want to repeat the well-known debates here about the EU's geopolitical turn or whether it's credible to export democratic norms when some member states are themselves backsliding. What I want to talk about are very quickly 4 challenges and paradoxes that, in my view, deserve more attention. Now, the first is what I call the inside-outside paradox of EU democracy support. Now, the EU itself is unique, right? It transcends the usual boundaries between domestic and foreign policy, but it still maintains a rather odd separation institutionally, but also, I would argue, intellectually, between internal and external democracy challenges. So the EU does democracy support in third countries and democracy protection inside, so for itself, inside the European Union. And now increasingly, I think that doesn't make sense. So threats like illiberal governance, corruption, hybrid warfare, disinformation, they don't respect borders, and they are challenging the EU as much as accession countries. Its external democracy toolkit is somehow disconnected also from this more internal focused mechanisms of democracy protection. And that, of course, for hybrid threats, that divide can be exploited. And we even see it also in the EU's institutions, Directorate Generals and the Commission, DG Just and DG, which is for internal democracy protection. And then another DG deals with external democracy promotion. So what can be done? I'm just mentioning randomly a few things. We could maybe think out of the box. We could apply Copenhagen criteria equally to both accession countries and member states. We could withhold accession funds, but also then internally trigger Article 7 sanctions to match this. There could be also rule of law mechanism to cover EU funding, including agriculture and cohesion funds. We could have election observation missions also in member states, and so on and so forth. So clearly here, there's some work to be done. Second, and it was mentioned before briefly, I would like to talk about legitimacy of the EU as a democracy model and the rise of identity politics. Now, in the past, EU authority was always accepted under what's being called a permissive consensus. So that's the idea, of the EU bringing benefits to everyone, and therefore, political elites take decisions accordingly, and that is being accepted by the general population. And so also that worked with enlargement, but that consensus is gone. Right? Public support for enlargement fluctuates. Populist and radical right parties in the European Parliament have formed some kind of identity-based opposition, is relatively cohesive against further widening and deepening. And of course, national identity is weaponized there by member states. Brussels framed as a threat to sovereignty. So this is all, relatively known, but we see similar trends also in accession countries. Right, so EU norms being portrayed as threats to local culture, or accession sort of as something like surrendering Orthodox Christian values, and that's of course getting a boost from Russian disinformation campaigns. And then illiberal regimes inside and outside of the EU are learning and reinforcing each other, of learning from and reinforcing each other. So what should the EU do? And to think here, this is a very broad field, and Richard also briefly touched upon it. We need to reimagine somehow the EU's normative power, but focusing also internally on support and also external projections. And my focus here, I would suggest, is not just also new forms as participatory legitimacy, as Richard mentioned, but also social equity. So, and I think that might be even more important than climate change, but is also related. And so that we basically have or extend this 2025 Pact for European Social Dialogue to accession countries, but also make social investments a priority in cohesion funds and pre-accession instruments. Right? And I think it's very important to remember that social equity and democracy are deeply interconnected. So countries with more equitable social policies tend to show higher democratic resilience. So let's make social benchmarks like access to healthcare, education, fair wages a core part to increase or try to increase again the acceptability of the EU as a project. Now, two last quick points. Third, the EU as a calm power. It's probably a weird thing to say these days, but in a world where panic and crisis politics are everywhere, I would argue that a calm, transparent, accountable governance is exactly what is needed for democratic resilience. And we've seen everywhere, like emergency politics, like Hungary's ongoing state of emergency, that undermines democracy and risks also setting dangerous precedents for candidate countries who may, or in fact already are, using this crisis metaphor as a pretext for backsliding. So democratic resilience is about the ability of institutions, societies to deliberate, right, adapt and innovate. It is not all solved by top-down decrees. So in my view, the EU, and it does already a good job, although that's usually turned against it as a criticism, it does somehow also partly avoid normalizing these crisis politics, this panic that we currently see, and then perhaps instead better to prioritize transparency, accountability, and pluralism. So as Jean Monnet famously said, Europe will be forged in crisis, yes, but let's make sure the solutions reinforce and not erode our democratic norms. And fourth, and again, perhaps a controversial point, the EU as a confident power. Now, in the late 1990s and 2000s, the EU may have been overconfident, and I would agree with this with regards to its ability and appeal as a global champion of democracy. But I think today, in my opinion, it risks going too far in the other direction. Right? It's becoming overly defensive and self-doubting. So, still we should remember the EU is the world's largest trading bloc, a regulatory superpower, if you want, a leading donor for democracy. Right? That's called smart power. And I think that gives it also a rather unique leverage. So that doesn't mean the EU has to become some kind of a new hegemon. It probably also can't, but it can certainly lead, for example, as a core of a network of democracies. So, and I think that in a world where the US is turning inward, the EU self-confidence is not only justified, but I think also absolutely necessary for sustaining democracy at home and abroad. So to conclude, can democracy survive in this changing world order? I believe it can. But as I said and argued, only if the EU addresses some of these internal and external paradoxes, and it addresses it, by bridging the gap between internal, external democracy support, confronting the rise of identity politics, resisting normalization of emergency politics, and reclaiming its self-confidence. And then that way, hopefully, the EU can help ensure democracy's resilience at home in accession countries, even if the US turns inward.
Thank you so much for that. So you and Richard agree on that it can survive, but you put conditions on it. So can I ask you a couple of elements that came out of my conversation with him, and then something else? Climate change, is that going to be the pivotal test as to how democracy goes or how people think? Is climate change that important?
Well, I would say that it is certainly also for a younger generation, but as I would argue, equally important are social issues and issues, related to social equity.
Okay.
Because I think if you ask, generally, that people are much more concerned, of course, also with healthcare, childcare. Do I get the enough wage for my work? And I think these are all issues that are equally relevant
when you're actually going to the ballot box. That is, thank you for that. And democracy and autocracy, is democracy better at delivering the basics like electricity, clean water, and all the rest of it, or do autocracies do better at that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a bit of a screwed, kind of question, because I think there's not just about the end goals, but also, of course, how we get there. And I think there is, even if you have an autocratic regimes that doesn't need to go through democratic processes, can potentially be better and quicker at delivering goods to people. But of course, the way that decision making is made, how people are involved in these decisions, is screwed. Plus, mostly. This comes with many sort of tweaks attached. For example, if we're looking at the resource curse, so there's governments that, of course, have a lot of money to spend because of energy, income, and so on and so forth. But whether that really reflects a strong economy that is sustainable in the long run and that can do without repression is a very different question.
And I just want to get back to that autocracy, democracy element again. I mean, the list of countries that I mentioned to you in the introduction, Armenia, Moldova, Georgia, that you've been to, that are on the fringes of Europe, describe to us how the people there feel when it comes to basic services. So they think, because they're torn now between Russia and whatever, this democratic backsliding, are they saying my electricity is going to be better off if Moscow controls, or are they saying it's going to be better off if we're part of the European Union?
I think that really also varies from country to country, but I would probably add to this mix that the problems are even more complex, because it's also about, will my country still exist tomorrow, right? And I think we shouldn't really forget this, because of course there's one impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and also its earlier invasion in Georgia. It's to send this message. And I think this was more of a question that is more relevant, I think, heightened in a country like Azerbaijan, where the population has, of course, been sort of bought off, or consensus has been bought off as a trade between, you keep quiet and there is repression, but at the same time there is wealth and so on and so forth. And I guess here, that the population has accepted this, but that doesn't really necessarily mean, we don't have really many insights. What are public opinion polls in Azerbaijan, also in Belarus? We simply don't know, right? And we've seen in Belarus that the uprising in 2020 was extremely strong, one of the biggest ever. Yeah. So, that consensus that is seemingly generated, through, delivering public goods more effectively in autocratic countries. I think this is also just a kind of a Potemkin village that simply because, nobody knows what the population really thinks.
Of course, because here in if you're a British citizen here at the moment, you've had democracy delivering Brexit that half the country doesn't want, and probably more than half the country doesn't want. Now we have potholes in the road and the National Health Service not working. So the autocratic tendencies in Britain is slightly on the rise. Can I finish by asking you a question from Philip Bowman? Is democracy strong, resilient enough to withstand world leaders with anti-democratic tendencies? Is the EU going to become confident and strong enough to do this?
Well, I think that our populations are. I mean, look at the European project as a whole, right? And where we came from after, the end of the Second World War. I mean, I think if there's any model of democratic resilience, right from the start, it would be the European Union itself. And I think that's something that we really shouldn't forget, that the EU has this history, and it stands as a presence of a successful, democratic, resilient bloc of countries.
Are nations sort of wondering where the democratic sort of beacon is now on human rights and transparency and accountability? Are they looking towards the European Union now?
No, I don't think there's anyone else left now that the US has exited. So I think that puts the EU in a more challenging, but also potentially in a better place, also when it comes to normative power, or gives a much more bigger potential for the EU to now live up, to its own ideals and standards, and not forget about them in all the crisis politics.
I was going to let you go, but a question has just this second come in from Giordana D'Andrea from the University of Surrey. It's fairly technical, so I'm just going to read it out as it is. How can the EU enforce the Copenhagen criteria on its MS when the current mechanisms, e.g. infringements, fund freeze, etc., do not seem to work? Could you firstly translate that for us and then answer it?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess the Copenhagen criteria are relatively clear. So these are criteria related to democracy and the rule of law, but also functioning democratic institutions and the functioning economy, and that is that accession countries have to comply to this. And current mechanisms, well, freezing funds to these governments. I would say this is the kind of conditionality that the EU has. It's kind of tools to combat or to tackle, address democratic backsliding in accession countries, and they don't seem to work. Now, my quick answer to this would be, and it's a very good question, I don't think it's a question necessarily of the EU's instruments. I think it's more of the EU's resolve and consistency of using them. And I think the case of Georgia is a very obvious one. I mean, here that the EU has witnessed democratic backsliding already for quite some time. And the response has been, oh, we don't approve exactly of what's going on, and please install a commission to potentially look into electoral fraud. But we would have had so many more instruments. But just look, for example, at certain assets of oligarchs in Georgia, for example, who have assets in Paris and somewhere else, big houses, nice mansions. Perhaps these can be sanctions. Could have been an option. We also have a trade agreement with Georgia and financial assistance related to this. So here the EU could have used many more impactful instruments, especially on the governing elite, to send more warning shots and more serious warning shots against democratic backsliding.
So your conclusion, if I'm writing this, is that democracy will survive, but the EU needs to start punching way above its weight to get stuff done and bring people in, and to be that magnet, that beacon that the US once was.
Yes, or use the existing instruments more consequently, more consistently.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Please stay with us. We will be back to you, I'm sure, and everybody here, because we are now going to our third contributor, who is in the United States, the place we've just been talking about, Dr. Dawn Brancati, the Institute for International and Public Affairs from Brown University, and her work goes wider than Europe. It focuses on peace building, primarily on the democratic tools to prevent and resolve violent conflicts within states, and that includes assessing whether elections are likely to lead to or help prevent violence. She is published widely, and she's going to be talking to us a little bit about examining the importance that American democracy had on helping other parts of the world, and what's going to happen now that that's stopped. Dawn Brancati, are things as bad as we're being told?
Well, fortunately, there's a lot of pushback now. So yes, Trump is violating the rule of law, and yes, he was democratically elected, and therefore the minimal definition of democracy is met in so much as our institutions elections were open and competitive. But fortunately, I'm not sure what you are hearing, but there is a lot of violations and challenges to the rule of law, but there's also a lot of pushback, protests in the street, as well as the courts challenging the violations of the rule of law from the U.S. president. And so I think it's actually a good example and a downturn in public opinion polls for President Trump. And so I actually think it's a little better than you might think, because it is showing that democracy is working. People are out in the streets and people are challenging it through the courts and legal systems.
Thank you. Sorry, that was a question, but could you now give us your present, is it a presentation? Give us your view on the wider world and democracy.
Absolutely. So I too, to answer the question posed to me, would agree that democracy abroad will survive the U.S.'s American first policy. To understand why I take this position, I want to make 2 points. First, I'd like to say that U.S. foreign policy has always been primarily driven by the U.S.'s national interests, regardless of the party or the president that has been in power. And as a result, that means that sometimes the U.S. has supported democracy abroad, and sometimes it's supported non-democratic powers abroad that are geopolitically important to the United States. The U.S. public generally supports this national interest approach to foreign policy. Most polls, for example, show that the majority of the U.S. public favored withdrawing from Afghanistan and didn't support remaining in Afghanistan to support U.S. goals beyond national security. Moreover, even after the Taliban's takeover and democracy was overturned, most polls show that a majority of Americans supported the withdrawal. So in general, most Americans do not support promoting democracy in other countries. Polls taken over more than a decade show that only about a quarter of Americans support promoting democracy in other countries. Therefore, the U.S. putting America first in its foreign policy is nothing new. What is new is that the policy under Trump is not an America first policy, but rather a Trump first policy. Thus, the U.S. will support democracy or democratic countries where it is in Trump's personal interest, and the U.S. will support non-democracies where it is in Trump's personal interest. Trump's position in the Ukraine war is a case in point. The Trump administration at present is seeking a peace deal that would leave Ukraine as an independent nation, but potentially with territorial concessions, and seemingly because it would benefit Trump's image and Trump's economic interests by lifting sanctions and opening Russia up to trade and investment. Further, it should be said that the U.S. withdrawing military support from autocratic regimes where it's not in Trump's issues could be actually a good thing for democracy. Second, in talking about whether democracy abroad will survive under the Trump administration, we have to consider how effective the U.S. has been in promoting democracy abroad. So I would say that the U.S. has been very successful in promoting democracy abroad when it has chosen to support democracy, has not been very successful, I apologize, in promoting democracy abroad when it's chosen to, and not wholly due to insufficient dedication, but due to the enormity of the endeavor among many other factors. In Afghanistan and Iraq, we have helped install middling democracies, and statistical analysis show that there's only a weak and inconsistent correlation between democracy in general and democratization. So that's not to say that a Trump first policy and the withdrawal of democracy aid abroad will not have an effect on democracy. It will. It will likely leave people with less access to free media. There will likely be less information about the quality of election in countries through reduced support for electoral monitors and so on and so forth. But the question itself of can democracy survive in the changing world order amidst the U.S.'s foreign first policy, I'd say gives too much credit to the U.S. in the first place for the state of democracy in other countries. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just taking a note of what you were saying there because it brought a thought to my mind. You mentioned Afghanistan. Well, we were there for 20 years and it collapsed like a house of cards very quickly. We were trying to install those democratic institutions and it just didn't work. This withdrawal from USAID and other elements that you mentioned, might that in fact help countries do it to work their own way to the best system of government? They have to come to some sort of pact and agreement between citizens and government, and that they work it out for themselves.
I think it can have cross-cutting effects, right? So in certain sense, it can be destabilizing in countries and lowering the, in terms of impoverishing citizens, and that is not necessarily a good thing. But again, they also need the resources to develop their democracy in the way that they see it. And without the aid that is supporting that can't happen. But also it would lead to less interference of developing democracy in the Western idea of what the United States believes democracy should look like.
Yeah, and because
people are studying that right now, so we're waiting to see what the effects will be.
Yeah, because I think in the introduction to you, I said that you've studied whether elections, which is that sort of benchmark of democracy in our own minds, actually can prevent or resolve violent conflicts or lead to violent conflicts.
It can do both.
So give us an example of a democracy that creates conflict that would be pushed by the United States or by us in Europe, and it's ended up in conflict.
So democracy is simply about free and fair elections, and you can put in leaders that support wars in other nations or leaders that do not support wars in other nations. And to put a greater halo effect around democracy, I think, is incorrect. So Israel's leaders have been democratically elected, and they are engaged in a violent battle against Gaza. And so that would be an example of a democracy that has engaged in war. In general, democracies are less hawkish, but only with other democracies. So.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. Can I put a question from Ajay Rator? Was the so-called rules-based order ever truly international, or only really focused on furthering the interests of the West? In other words, if I could add to that, that the democracy message, values, whatever you want to call it, was just a mechanism to further Western interests?
I think that is a little negative of the view. I do think, I mean, U.S. does not go often necessarily in with the intention only to democratize other countries, but I do think so. For example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, once in those countries, did attempt to establish democracy in those countries, but was not successful in doing it. So I don't think it is just a cover in many cases for our strategic agenda, but that we do have that intention to establish democracy. It is costly, it is difficult, and we don't always have the motivation to dedicate the resources and have a long staying power in order to achieve those goals.
And can I then come to you with the 2 points that I asked your fellow panelists? Climate change, when people are thinking about what sort of government they want in the areas you cover, how important is that?
In the countries that I see, I don't see it to be the pivotal issue. It continues to be the economy, and people are supportive of democracy where their economic interests are met, and where their economic are met by an erosion of democracy, by a leader who wants a centralization of the state. They will support that leader who might erode democracy. At least here in the United States, climate change is not the issue, though it is an important issue. It is not the driving issue of what their support is for democracy.
Yes. And ironically, of course, the solar panels and the electric cars are now coming from China, the autocracy, which gets me to the second point that we've been discussing, this idea that democracy or autocracy delivers better elements like schools and electricity and fresh water. Which do you know which one delivers the best?
So the research will say that there is, in general, a higher correlation between democracy and economic development. In terms of economic growth among democracies versus autocracy, there is neither one of them perform better than the other. I think the question is, to whom, right? And I would hope, although again, the research isn't quite there yet, that among democracies, it delivers it to a larger group of people than autocracies, but that autocracies can deliver it to a very strong subset of the population.
That's really good. Thank you for that. And I like that to whom element there, because that does actually sort of sum a lot of it up. Finally, we go to our last panelist before opening out for wider discussion to Professor Nic Cheeseman of the University of Birmingham and founder of CEDAR, that is the Center for Elections, Democracy, Accountability and Representation. His recent books have looked at the moral economy in Africa, including How to Rig an Election and the Foundations of Authoritarian Rule, paying particular attention to the role of ideas, which I like a lot. How do we go about fighting for democracy at home and abroad? Nic Cheeseman, show us the way.
Thanks so much. The first thing I want to do is I think we need to say a little bit more about the performance of democracies and authoritarian states. First of all, the latest round of cross-national analysis tells us that democracies actually grow more than authoritarian states. And a lot of the research on parts of the world that might need to grow the most, like sub-Saharan Africa, shows us that not only do democracies outperform authoritarian states on economic growth, the longer a country is a democracy, the better that democratic dividend is. What we often get distracted by is a small number of exceptionally well-performing authoritarian states. Rwanda is the figurehead in Africa. China is the figurehead globally. What the data actually shows us is that those states are actually the exceptions rather than the norm. We get a very small number of authoritarian states performing exceptionally well. And those states do outperform their democratic counterparts. But we get many, many, many more authoritarian states right at the bottom, performing really badly. And so on average, authoritarian states perform worse than democratic states. If you want some evidence on this and you're watching and you think this is, a Western guy trying to promote democracy, the figures must be wrong, go to the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Look at the top 10 least corrupt countries and say what type of regime they are. Look at the top 10 most corrupt countries, look at what type of the regime they are. What you will find consistently is the best governed countries in the world, the least corrupt countries in the world, on average, are democracies. And we really have to be careful not to get caught into a game where we play the autocrats game of cherry picking a small number of authoritarian cases that have done well and ignoring the hundreds of authoritarian cases that encourage conflict, that encourage corruption, that encourage neo-patrimonial politics and deliver very little for their citizens. Having said that, I just want to take a step back because we've been very US focused so far. And that's totally understandable. The US is a major player in global democracy, has been for a very long time. And the recent cuts and attack on USAID have been both confusing and traumatic for many people around the world. But we have to put it into context. And the context is that what has happened in the US is only one of 3 global trends that are undermining democracy right now. So one is the US, and I would say it's not just the fact that the US has cut money for democracy around the world. It's also that it's actually attacked organizations like USAID as criminal organizations, essentially giving autocrats around the world the language they need to attack pro-democracy forces in their own countries. Second, though, we need to pay serious attention to a wider set of global powers. Russia and China, for example. China was a pragmatic player around the world, but isn't anymore. It's more now promoting a serious authoritarian agenda abroad. Russia is doing the same thing and supporting countries that will be loyal to Russia, but often very authoritarian regimes. Look at the way Russia has stepped in as the partner of last resort for countries in West Africa where the regimes have been overthrown by military juntas, for example. So we have the American developments, but we also have a more assertive set of global superpowers. Underpinning this, and often ignored, but actually critical, is a role of what I would call authoritarian middle powers. Countries like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. We tend to ignore these countries because they don't have the capacity of the great powers, but they're actually playing significant roles, leading the way for autocracy, both in their own regions and around the world. How do they do this? In some cases, by cross-border repression, actually repressing the members of their own diaspora in other countries. In some cases, by deliberately building authoritarian networks that enables them to spread authoritarian legislation and practices, but also by operating within multilateral institutions, the United Nations, other regional bodies, and using those institutions to actually try and push back on democratic norms and values. In other words, watering down human rights commitments, watering down commitments to democracy. As a result, ensuring that those institutions are less effective at defending democracy and promoting it in the future. This is a fundamental challenge to the international rules-based liberal order. It is a much bigger challenge than just what is presented by the United States. And the combined effect of these 3 trends has undermined the global brand of democracy. It's undermined the ability of democracies to actually promote democracy abroad, and it's undermined the capacity of our most important multilateral institutions to respond. So I do believe that democracy can survive this moment, but I think we need to recognize that the threat is perhaps, if anything, even bigger than my excellent co-panelists have so far suggested. We see this not only in terms of the way that democracy is playing out around the world, but also the way that democracy is playing out at home. So if we consider, for example, the European Union, we have to think about the impact of Russian disinformation and interference in countries within Europe, but in the Russian sphere of influence. We also have to think about the way that authoritarian middle powers are deliberately attempting to subvert European institutions. Think about, for example, the famous case of the Azerbaijani laundromat. This is a case where the Azerbaijani government laundered a 2.9 billion program to essentially use UK-based shell companies to bribe members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to water down criticism of Azerbaijan's human rights record. In this example, we see cross-national corruption and authoritarian networks working through companies in the UK to undermine a supposedly democratic body to weaken commitments to democratic norms. Not only does that mean that we're less well placed to defend democracy globally, it also means that the UK and the European political system is being compromised as a result of the deliberate actions of authoritarian powers. Now, sadly, this situation is even worse than I've so far made it seem, because the world is becoming more authoritarian. We have more authoritarian states today than we did 10 years ago. And sadly, we're probably going to have more authoritarian states in the next 5 years than we do right now. We're in a situation where probably in a few years' time, we might have less than 5% of the world's population living in full democracies. And one thing about having that many authoritarian states in the world is that it emboldens other countries to be more authoritarian. So one of the things we're seeing is an increasingly authoritarian world exacerbate and embolden authoritarian leaders in a context in which international institutions are less well placed to respond. I'm talking to you today from South Africa. So a couple of quick points on how this is playing out here. First of all, we can see the deliberate and conscious effect and very destabilizing effect of some of these authoritarian middle powers right here on the continent. The war in Sudan, for example, the civil war, has partly been furthered by the support of the United Arab Emirates for one of the key factions, a paramilitary faction, the RSF, which is actually accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnically motivated killings. We can see, for example, the role of a number of other authoritarian middle powers, including Qatar, including Saudi Arabia, including Turkey. Now, this is not to say that the US, the UK, Germany, the EU have always been angels. It's not to say that everybody else always played by the democratic rules. As Dawn said brilliantly, often self-interest and national interest shapes foreign policy, whether it comes to democracy or anything else. But we have to be conscious that there are now a growing number of authoritarian partners for states in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And in some cases, those partners are explicitly supporting organizations and movements that are committing severe crimes against humanity. And that means a very significant implication for what might happen in the future. So just to give you an example of a country I was in recently, I was in Malawi, looking at the prospects for the elections, which are coming up in September. The US cuts, as Dawn said, have not just had a kind of mild effect in the Malawian context, they've had a devastating effect for democracy support. We think, in total, the US cuts may have resulted in something like 5,000 more jobs being lost in Malawi. Let's keep in mind that many of these jobs were people who are Malawian citizens working hard to support Malawian families and their dependents. There was no notice this was going to happen. There was no warning this was going to happen. This is an existential economic shock to many of the public services across Africa, including health services, but also to the democracy sector. The democracy sector in Malawi, the democracy organizations that have worked so hard to try and strengthen Malawian democracy, were planning ahead for that election in September, planning voter education, civic education programs, planning domestic observation programs to safeguard the vote. A lot of those programs were going to be funded by US money. Pulling that money out at the last minute has threatened and put into jeopardy the plans of those organizations to protect Malawian democracy coming into a crucial, and we expect very competitively fought, election. So there's a really significant impact here of what's happened in the US. But as I say, we need to understand it in this broader context, because we also know that other countries like the UAE and others are also interested in becoming partners of Malawi. And we are going to see countries in Africa face a very different opportunity and challenge in the future than what they faced in the past. We know that pro-democracy donors are going to be less significant and giving less money, and authoritarian partners are going to be more significant and giving more money. So there's a real risk that what that does is create a double whammy effect, effectively emboldening autocrats and undermining democratic resistance at the same time. Now, that might sound like quite a pessimistic, worrying narrative, but I want to end with positivity. I think Malawi, as well as being an example of some of the challenges that we face in strengthening democracy in the current world, also reminds us that democracy, like hope, springs eternal. And the reason for that is that the last time there was a major democratic episode and crisis in Malawi, in 2019, 2020, when the 2019 elections were extremely controversial, Malawi sorted it out largely without high levels of international intervention. That was a period during COVID-19. It was a period in which it wasn't necessarily very easy to send election observers. And so after the 2019 elections had been cancelled, after the courts ruled that they were not legal, there was a rerun election in 2020 that didn't have the same level of international support as an election normally would. There were not big deployments of international election observers, for example. And yet the efforts of the new Electoral Commission in Malawi, the efforts of civil society groups and Malawian citizens, the efforts of a wide range of political parties and journalists all came together to ensure that that election was much more successful than the previous one. It actually resulted in a transfer of power. It was a peaceful transfer of power, and Malawi became one of the only countries in the world to move back towards democracy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's important to remind ourselves that countries don't become democratic because of international factors. Donors and others can help. They can play an important role at the margins. But the reason countries become stable democracies is because of the democratic fights that happen within those countries themselves. So over the next 5 years, the world will probably become more authoritarian. But some countries will win important fights for democracy. And in those countries, the fact that that fight was more domestically fought and domestically rooted will put them in a better position to develop sustainable and stronger democracy moving forwards. Thank you.
Nic Cheeseman, thank you very much for that. A lot of thoughts coming out of it. The first one is that the situation that you've just described with the autocracies on the rise, and given that sudden withdrawal of funds that you just said, say to Malawi and all over the world, has trust in America as a leading beacon of democracy and the world's-based order, whatever we want to call it, has that permanently been eroded?
I think it's been fundamentally undermined. Whether it's permanent partly depends on what happens in the second half of the Trump presidency and after Trump. But absolutely. I mean, one thing we have to keep in mind is that there are an awful lot of people across Africa and the rest of the world who are owed money by the US government because they were doing work that was being funded through USAID. USAID was shut down in such a shoddy way that their contracts were not honored. And so we have people who are out of work and actually out of pocket. Those memories will take a very long time. And there's a lot of bitterness towards the US for the promises that have not been kept.
And does it matter? I mean, talking about this autocracy, democracy thing that's developing here, is that if you're sitting on the fence on this, you're looking at America and you says, okay, there might be a better president the next time, but the system that they've got is unpredictable. And we could well have, and it's not as if Trump was a one-off, he's back again for the second time. So therefore we have to go elsewhere for our pathways and for our money and for our future.
Exactly. And if you think you could look at China and you could get the same support for the next 5 or 6 years, or you could look at the US and cut a deal with Trump, but he might change his mind tomorrow, and it might be a Democrat at the next election, and it might be Trump, Mark II, Pence, Vance, somebody else at the future election. That unpredictability makes America an unreliable partner. And one of the things that really surprises me about the strategy Trump is employing is that it's self-defeating. America is burning for very little value its own soft power around the world. And soft power is a major factor in US influence. The US recently, for example, put out some plans that might see it remove many of its embassies in Africa. Yeah. Anybody who knows anything about foreign policy will tell you this is a disastrous step. It would actually save the US relatively little money and undermine the capacity of the US to have the influence it's had around the world for the last 20, 30 years. So one of the things that's really interesting here is that in some ways this actually seems to be a counterproductive policy. It's based on the idea that you can keep bullying people for long enough to get them to do what you want. But at some point you might have to persuade them. And Trump is undermining the US's capacity to persuade the rest of the world to see like America does. It
also strips dignity, doesn't it? Because when you have this thing saying, people are lining up to kiss my ass about getting these deals, I think if I was sitting in Malawi or Vietnam, I would think, well, hold on. So can China deliver for them what they want? I mean, not democracy. Can they deliver?
China and Russia can deliver a lot. But if you look at the record of China and Russia, there's two important things to note. One, they haven't supported that many public services. They haven't provided that much in simple foreign aid. China has been excellent at Belt and Road, at providing infrastructure. Russia has provided some money and some security cover, but Russia, for example, is a country, roughly with a GDP the size of a moderate European state. It cannot afford to provide the kind of financial support that African governments have needed in the past to provide public services.
But
so
China
the idea
can
that
build
Russia,
airports and roads and bridges and hospitals and all that sort of thing, can't it?
absolutely, but China also may not want to step in and play that role, right? There will be increasing pressures on the Chinese economy over the next 5 years. I think what we'll probably see is not a swap from the United States on the one hand to China on the other, but an increasing diversification. Some engagements with the UAE, some with Turkey, some with Saudi, some with China, some with Russia, some with the United States. It will become a very multipolar, complex world. And I think that's a really important message for people maybe on the call to hear. We are not going back to the Cold War. We're not going to see the United States versus Russia Mark II. We're going to see a very complicated context with lots of different levels of authoritarian powers, each trying to mark their own territory, each with their own agency, and it's not going to be as clear-cut as the Cold War in any way. The other thing we have to remind people is that the outcome is going to be different. Right? The US won the Cold War because the economy was growing and it ended up being able to outmaneuver Russia. The other outcome is going to come this time around. The economic opportunities are for the authoritarian states. So if we see that big battle this time around, it's not going to simply be an outcome of democracy and neoliberalism winning. We're more likely to see the other outcome. And that's why it's so important, as other people have said, that the democracies of the world actually start to see common cause, understand this as a security risk as well as a democracy risk, and form more effective alliances.
Nick, thank you very much for that. I wanted to bring in the rest of the panel, go round the rest of the panel. We have a question from Dan Croggan, which I think is quite salient for our discussion. Could the US be called democratic since its governments are funded by capital interests and more likely to serve them, and most of its media is owned only by a few corporations? Could, Richard, you're still with it? Could you address that for us, Richard? I also want to drill down a little bit on what is the danger of these autocracies, the Turkey, the UAE, these middle ranking countries. Are they really a threat to us, or do we have to have this polarization? Richard.
On the US question, I think Dawn answered this in essence. I think the US probably still meets a minimal definition of democracy, but there is no clear dividing line between autocracy and democracy. And the US democracy is clearly of diminished quality today compared to where it stood 4 or 5 months ago. And these issues of state capture by private interest and diminishment of judicial independence are all very familiar parts of the way in which regimes can chip away at democratic checks and balances. And I think that's the pathway that the US is set upon now. As Dawn was intimating at, I think the big debate is not so much Trump's intentions, but whether the pushback against this will be effective enough to hold it at bay so that US democracy proves resilient. It may come out of the second Trump administration in a rather precarious state, but not damaged at a systematic level. If the pushback is not strong, if it doesn't gather force, then I think the outcome could look even worse than it appears at the moment. In terms of your second question related to what all the issues Nick was putting on the table, for me, I think we're debating two slightly different issues. One is whether the international context, the political context, is so serious that democracy is threatened, even in its kind of Western heartlands. And from a democracy forum based in London, whether the issue is whether democracy, even in Europe, is now under threat. A separate question is whether the international context now is just too challenging for Western nations to do anything useful in terms of supporting democracy abroad. And I think those are two slightly different questions. I think so far as Giselle was also mentioning, there is some fairly robust democratic resilience within Europe itself. The underlying problems facing democracy is still there, but democracy has not collapsed yet. These problems have been around now for 10, 15 years, so they're not new by any stretch of the imagination. As you started off saying, Humphrey, they do predate the Trump administration. As Nick was saying, this is not just a debate about Trump, but deeper structural issues facing democracy. So I think these strategies of democratic resilience probably have a lot more traction in terms of the debate about internal European democracy. I think all the other panelists are right in saying our level of ambition in trying to underpin democratic norms globally, it probably needs to be set lower in the future. The dynamics are very complicated. It may be in the future we don't have such ambition, such high level ambition to support democracy in a wholesale sense internationally, given what's happening with Turkey and other medium-sized non-democratic powers that you were mentioning. But a lot of useful things can still be done to try and help the democratic actors that are fighting those democratic battles that Nick was talking about. So I don't believe that we should give up the ghost completely in terms of that international dimension, even though it's going to be a lot thinner and of lower ambition in the future.
Yes, I'd just like to throw in a banana skin in a way to this, is that should we change the name democracy? Because with Afghanistan and Iraq and the Arab Spring and goodness knows what else, it has become a kind of polarizing slogan. But I think what we're talking about here is that it's really about good governance, isn't it? About how to deliver a system that brings good governance. Am I wrong about that? Richard, if you could just give me your talking rubbish sort of thing, or yes, you might have a point, and then we can move on to Giselle.
Maybe it's simply, I don't know. I think it goes back to actually your book that I remember, Humphrey, talking about this controversy around the term of democracy in countries that have been authoritarian and trying to implement democracy, and that turns out to be very destabilizing. I think it depends on different countries. I think in European countries, people mobilize for democracy, not for good governance. In the EU's external relations, they tend to often talk about rule of law, good governance, more than talking about democracy, because the EU does seem to realize that this is more sensitive. But one has to say it is democracy that tends to bring people out in the street. People are not on the streets with placards saying we want good governance. They want democracy. They want the ability to throw their leaders
they want a voice, don't they?
Out of power. They want a voice. They want those kind of simple things. But I do think you raise a good question, that we do need to think of a better narrative and better terms to try and re-legitimize this whole agenda, because this, as the others were saying, we should not underestimate just how much this whole democracy agenda is now treading water and has lost a lot of its previous credibility.
Giselle, it's up to the EU to do that, isn't it?
Well, I think the EU has certainly learned also, I think, a lot in its democracy promotion over the years. It always came with a colonial legacy as well. We shouldn't forget that too. And it has faced significant criticism.
And a lot of war and bloodshed to get to where we are at the moment.
Correctly. So, and I think that is partly also, and what was mentioned before, that there's also some double standards, right? We have been very critical towards Belarus, for example, and much less critical towards Azerbaijan because of energy dependencies, and I can continue this argument, finding a lot of other examples. And I think from this, I think the EU can also learn, but also in comparison to the US, I think there is that the EU has been much more focused already on the more regional, say, approach to its democracy promotion. I think the US has been scattered much more broadly, where the EU already placed quite a premium on a number of strategically important countries in the past. For example, its eastern neighborhood, and I think that's an approach that it was controversial back then as well. But I think that is already a fair enough compromise between having this ambition to be the champion of democracy worldwide, but then but combine it with a more selective regional focus. But I would like to say one more point again, where Richard emphasized that there should be less ambition. I think it should be right the opposite. It should not be this sort of colonial style ambition to be the world's next leader of the free world. But I think the EU can be a bit more ambitious because it has its leverage on a number of countries, and it can use its instruments much more effectively if it plays out the leverage that it has. And I think to completely withdraw from democracy support and because of securitization dynamics, etc., I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. So I don't think we should replace democracy support with any more sort of defensive notions, and
so we should
certainly not replace democracy.
We should keep the name democracy, but you're saying that the EU should get more muscle, as it were. Richard, you're saying that all the democracies need to sort of forge together with one message or one pathway at this stage. Is that right?
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting we give up on the democracy agenda. Quite the opposite. I thought I was clear saying we should definitely not do that. But I think where big, powerful authoritarian regimes are very, very well ensconced in power, I don't think the EU has the leverage to completely change the nature of those regimes. I think, as others were saying, that you can still do more than it's doing at present to try and empower democratic actors, but ultimately they will have the primary agency in deciding and determining whether democracy prospers or not. And I think that the EU should pitch its level of ambition there.
And there's no other sort of organization that could do. You've got the G7, you've got the UN, you've got the Commonwealth, you've got the BRICS probably on the other side. Is there another organization that can do that? Dawn, perhaps you can come in on that one. Who can lead this survival of democracy?
Well, I think I agree with many of my co-panelists that much of the burden and the responsibility and the success of democracy depends on the individual countries themselves and the civil society and the leaderships within those countries. And so I wouldn't be looking to another institution to create democracy in other countries, but the people themselves.
The people. And I remember a book that some of you may remember or not, by an academic called Paul Collier, who wrote Bottom Billions about 15 or 20 years ago. And he actually had a graph. And if I remember correctly, it was that if you implement democracy at less than $2,500 GDP per capita, there is a danger of violence breaking out. But if you don't implement it above that, there's also a danger of things going wrong. Dawn, did you know this book, or does that argument agree with you?
I know the book. I don't know where the data comes from and the quality of the analysis. I think it has something to go way back to Jaworski's work that was data that's 20 years old. And so I won't comment on the, I think of pinpointing an exact figure is not.
Nick, do you agree with that premise? I mean, you're an Africa expert as much as anything, that there is a certain level of economy that has to be there for.
I think wealth matters, right? I mean, and Dawn's right. You know, it goes a long way back. We know that countries that have a good GDP per capita are more likely to survive if they're authoritarian or if they're democratic. So if you've got a wealthy autocracy, it's more likely to survive. If you've got a wealthy democracy, it's more likely to survive. That's true. I think one of the questions that's tough for us is, you know, what's the system that actually helps you get there, right? So rather than starting wealthy, what's the country that gets you there? And we've seen some countries, the tiger economies famously do very well as authoritarian states. We've seen other parts of the world where the conditions are different and authoritarianism has repeatedly failed to generate economic growth. So think about Africa. 1960 to 1990, the vast majority of countries in Africa were authoritarian. They were one-party states. They were military regimes. You know, Botswana, Mauritius were the exceptions. In that entire period, almost no countries in Africa grew. Now, one of the reasons for that is the unfair global system, but it's also because the system of authoritarianism was exploitative, wasteful, and corrupt. So the idea that these countries are going to grow and build up that state infrastructure and become stronger and more viable and get to the wealth where democracy will work by being authoritarian, to me, this is just a historical pie-in-the-sky nonsense. Actually, in most cases, the best way to build stable, successful states and economies in Africa has been to struggle through the difficult, tumultuous challenge of building democracy. Those are the countries, long-term democracy, Mauritius and others, that have actually been more successful at generating economic transformation. So I think it's a really good question. I think ideally countries would be wealthy and then they can introduce democracy and it would be more stable. I think in reality, we have to deal with the messy reality that most countries have to try and get there through one of these pathways. And in most countries, I think democracy is a better pathway than authoritarianism.
And like Dawn says, it's not up to the model that's brought in by the EU or by an aid agency. It's how that country itself wants to forge its democracy.
And I think where aid was good, it gave domestic actors, it gave activists on the street space to write their own history. You know, the best aid never was about telling countries to be democratic or trying to force democracy on countries that had no prospect. It was about creating a space where domestic actors could actually act. So, for example, using your influence to stop people being shot in the streets, using your influence to provide funding to enable people to speak their truth, and then enabling and empowering those organizations on the ground that represent their citizens to go and fight for democracy and win it for themselves. That's a much better way to build a long-lasting, stable process. Though aid in the international community could play a really important role there, but it's important to remember that, as it were, we should be leading from behind, right? And we should never think that we are the ones that are delivering democracy. And if we do, the problem is that we deliver a democracy that's not very sustainable. We've seen that in Afghanistan. We've seen that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we did try and do those other things. So I think we should keep in mind, as Richard says, that even under these really tough conditions, there are going to be important roles that we can play as an international community, not in generating democracy, but that was never what we were doing, but in creating the opportunities for people to fight for their own democracy. And we can still do that, and we should. Yes, and I think, as Giselle was saying, we should do more of it right now.
Sorry, go on. Yep.
I would just like to add a positive figure that about 20-25% of protests that are for democracy lead to democratic reforms in countries.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that word democracy does actually help open doors and nudge things forward. And what you were saying, Nick, actually, in fact, what you're all saying, it's a pity you don't disagree with each other, resonates with me, because I remember being up in Karamoja in northern Uganda. I'm sure you know that area, Nick, which is very, very poor. And the guy there they needed stockades built around to stop cattle rustling, but the EU wouldn't provide them because they hadn't done a gender balancing classes and filled in their democracy boxes ticked. And he just threw up his hands with despair. And I think that was some years ago now, when what you were saying, Nick, we were trying to put, what we thought was necessary amongst some cattle herders, illiterate cattle herders that just wanted to protect their cattle. And I think that's a sort of well-known sample of how the West got it wrong. So we're wrapping up now, but I think all of you agree that democracy will survive. What I want to pin down is how. What is that pathway? What do we have to do, as well as shouting and pushing forward? And if you could just sum up the challenges in building a solid democracy. How long does it take to build those institutions? If it failed after 20 years in Afghanistan, how long should we give it before we start saying a country's autocratic or it's corrupt or something like it? Let's go around backwards. So Nick, I'm going to start with you, and let's go round again.
I think one of the things we've learned from America, right, is that democracy has never consolidated. And in a sense, what we got entrapped, and I think political scientists and academics were as much to blame as anyone, was thinking we had a set of fairly established democracies we didn't need to worry about over there, and we had some new democracies over there we needed to worry about, these authoritarian states that we needed to convert. And that wasn't true. We should have been paying much more attention to the inherent weaknesses in almost all democratic systems, which is that they are vulnerable to subversion from within. They're vulnerable to disinformation. They're vulnerable to bad quality media. They're vulnerable to inequality and the dangers of neoliberalism. And I think we needed to pay more attention to that from the beginning. So I think it's a great question, Humphrey, but if it's okay, I'd sort of flip it around and say, actually, we need to try and resist doing that. And one of the things that we also need to resist doing is saying, you know what, we've got this country to a reasonably stable place after 20 years. Let's stop the democracy programs now. I've seen us do that. I've seen the international community say, that's 2 good elections. Let's not worry about the next one. As if 2 good elections mean there's no risk. As if you, having invested so much, you wouldn't make sense to invest a bit more to make sure a country stays on that path. So I think it's a great question, but I think we should turn it around and say, actually, democracy is always vulnerable. And one of the things we need to do is match the work we're going to do internationally with even more work domestically to strengthen our own domestic systems. Yeah. Otherwise, one thing is for sure, all the countries that we're currently speaking for will be less democratic in 5 years than they are right now.
Okay, and of course, if a figure like Trump was elected in Malawi or Uganda or Indonesia or something, those institutions might not be strong enough to push back against him, which was what Dawn was telling us. Dawn, give us your final thoughts.
I will simply just say that there is not one pathway towards democracy, that there are many different pathways to a democracy, and that's a good thing, and that we're not relying on one route.
And do you agree with Nick's figures, or are you more optimistic?
No, as I agreed with many of everything that Nick has also said today, that yes, democracy is vulnerable and we should be focusing on that.
Yeah, and will the American institutions be able to withhold?
I pray so, and I believe so. And I'm more optimistic because of the pushback we are now seeing successfully through our legal system with the media, the Associated Press succeeding in its lawsuit, the universities now stepping up, not always, forced to step up, not necessarily taking the moral ground, but they are now fighting back as well, and the courts making decisions that are upholding the rule of law. So it will be long, it will not be fast, but I do believe it will ultimately hold up.
I mean, that is a lesson, actually.
Holds up for me.
That is a general lesson of elections and strong institutions, which are the two elements that are needed to uphold a democracy. Giselle, you are sitting in the front line of European democracy, which has had more wars and bloodshed, I think, than any other place in the world. Give us your final thoughts.
The former Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt once said, we cannot expect Belarus to turn into a Nordic democracy by tomorrow. So I think I can only reinforce the argument that democracy support and also building democracies is something that takes a very, very long breath, and it takes time. And I can also only second my colleagues here that should be a process, mainly driven also from within the country. However, I think on that note, we shouldn't be too naive, because if the West withdraws democracy support for one reason or another, or plays a much more defensive role, I think this will, it will not necessarily in this world order right now, or what is emerging, suddenly give more agency to these countries. Potentially quite the opposite, because another, autocratic regime comes in, a middle power or a bigger power, and then that's the end of agency in that country. So, and we see that also happening in Syria now, for example. So I think we have to be very careful with this too. And that is my final point, that we must strike a very, very careful balance between, on the one hand, also our, security interests, and also where we use a normative power, to the extent, that on the one hand, we still play a meaningful role and have leverage, but on the other hand, also still to allow as much agency as possible within countries to grow. And I think this is going to be, one of the main challenges that democracy support now faces.
Yeah, it's adapting and planning. Richard, sum up for us. You started us and finish us off with a conclusion and a cracking point.
In line with the others, I would say democracy can't be saved in any full or permanent sense through some kind of magic template of institutional changes. Certain kind of institutional modifications can help, better social and economic conditions can help, but democratic quality will always fluctuate back and forth. Democracy is struggle, it always has been. That's part of its core essence. I think for me, the one issue that will be really determining in the future is this, what we might call the quality of civic agency. It's important for democracies to reform their institutions, to get the good governance structures right, so on and so forth. But I think underpinning everything has to be much more vibrant and sense of civic agency. And I think the problem at the moment is that governments pay lip service to democracy of a fairly tamed and circumscribed kind that doesn't really allow for this full playing out of civic agency. And I think if democracy is going to demonstrate itself as the system most capable of dealing with all these challenges in the future, it has to allow for a much fuller flowering of this kind of full citizen participation.
Okay, I like that as a final thought. I can remember that and I can go and tell it to people in the pub. So thank you very much for that. We are out of time. 90 minutes of collegiate, no disagreements really, and insightful debate, and the seconds have flown by. We have concluded that democracy will survive, but it needs bigger civil agency and it needs sort of individual pathways by the countries themselves. Thank you, audience, for your incisive questions, which sharpened my thoughts. And thank you, panel, Richard Youngs, Dawn Brancati, Giselle Bosse, and Nic Cheeseman. Please look out for our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, which also drills down into issues often overlooked by the mainstream media. Our next Democracy Forum debate is at 2 p.m. London time, May the 14th, where we will be discussing, against the backdrop of a US-China trade war, how an EU-India free trade agreement could be a game changer. That will be very interesting. And please join us for that. And on June the 30th, we have a streamed and live in-person evening event at London's National Liberal Club. An Asian NATO, is that a pipe dream or a future security network? If you're in London and want to come, please let us know. Thank you, everybody. You've been really good. My learning curve has shot up on that. Until next time, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, thank you and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.